All right, I think we're live. So, hey everyone, welcome to the keynote speech. My name is Peter and I'm a junior at Stanford majoring in math. I'll be your host and Matthew will be co-hosting.
Hey everyone, I'm Matthew. Excited for the talk today. And I am a master's student also at Stanford, studying physics and computer science.
And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Rsa Krauthamer. Working at the forefront of quantum computing, she is the founder and CEO of Quantum Thought, as well as founder and chief product officer at QSecure. She serves on the advisory board of the AI Ethics Journal and is a member of the Newsweek Expert Forum, as well as an advisor to She Quantum and is a frequent speaker on quantum computing and technology ethics. Rsa holds a BS in symbolic systems from Stanford University, and previously she founded NeuralEdge, where as its CTO, she built an advanced artificial intelligence software platform for sales enablement. Rsa will be giving a 20-minute talk followed by 20 minutes of Q&A from the audience in the Twitch chat. So please put any questions in chat throughout and we'll address them after the talk. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Rsa.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you so much for having me today. It's really exciting to see so many people that are excited about quantum. When I first got into it several years ago, Jack Hittery, who is the head of quantum and AI at Alphabet X, formerly Google X, did a small study to see how many people were working in the quantum field, both in academia and in private industry. And he counted 800 people. Obviously not a whole lot. So when Peter told me that the number of people registered for this is almost double that, that's very, very exciting to me as someone who is very excited about quantum. So it's an honor to be here with everyone here who are the current and future minds of the quantum computing industry. So I'm going to pull up some general slides. So give me 1 second. Let's see. Okay. Well, I'm having some technical difficulties, so I'm just going to talk to you. And that's fine because I know you guys have already had a good amount of technical presentations. So I'm not going to go into the qubits. What I'm going to talk about is how I stumbled into quantum, because I come from a very untraditional background if you consider quantum computing as a whole. What I've learned on my journey and what I believe the next 10 years look like for quantum computing, and hopefully get you all very excited to be in this space. So I'll start with my story. Thanks, Peter. I'll start with my story. So it didn't start necessarily in quantum computing. My background actually is in AI, and that's what I studied. But it also didn't start in college. A lesser known fact about me that you won't see on my resume is that I actually started when I was 7 years old, when I was asked to be a body double in a movie called Bicentennial Man, which is a movie, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's a Robin Williams movie about a robot on a quest to become a human. And I often think about that and how funny it is that I started out there, because what really drew me into quantum ultimately was via AI and via these big questions about what it means to be a human and how to actually reverse, not in the sense of a robot trying to become a human, but how do we as humans try to understand how thinking things think, how consciousness works, etc., and how to translate that into a computer program. And that's what we try to do when we do AI. So my acting career didn't work out, as you can see, and I ended up fortunate enough to go to Stanford, where I think a number of you attend. And this was back, I started Stanford in 2009, so a little over 10 years ago, when we were starting to use GPUs and things like that to do real deep learning, etc. So it was a really cool time to be around. And I stumbled on this major called symbolic systems. And for those of you who don't know about symbolic systems, it's it's a combination of computer science and philosophy and cognitive science, all sort of built around this idea of how do you make artificial intelligence. And, you know, even more non-traditionally, it was my first CS class that really drew me in. It was my first philosophy class, Philosophy 80, for any of you who've taken it. And it was these big questions of, again, what makes a thinking thing think? What is consciousness? And it was this realization that we actually have no idea, right? You know, with all of the science that we do and all of the exciting things that we now know, these are still big open questions. So when I got out of school, I stumbled around a bit again and did consulting, did a bit of traveling, but those big questions always stuck with me. And so after a time, I couldn't avoid AI anymore, and I came back. But I only had my bachelor's. So I felt very much like everybody else in the field would know more than me. So what I decided to do was I decided to start freelancing in machine learning and AI. And for some reason, people decided to work with me and hire me, even though I knew very little. And I learned a ton on the job. I took jobs in natural language processing, in computer vision, in you name it, I did it. Some things more successful than others. I learned very quickly that though I thought it was an easy problem to predict things like the stock market, if that was actually easy, people would have done it by now. So some problems are much harder to solve than others. And I finally got to the point where I started getting frustrated. I knew enough that I started getting frustrated with the limitations of our hardware, even GPUs and the most advanced tools that we have nowadays to do machine learning and AI on. And it was around that time that my now co-founder came to me and introduced the idea of quantum computing. And I had no idea what quantum computing was at that point. This was about 3 years ago. It was a revelation to me, as I imagine it was to many of you, that quantum computers were real things, not just sci-fi, and that you could actually use them to do things, very basic things, as you know. But this, for me, you know, as I went on my first journey into the IBM Q quantum composer experience, which I'm sure a lot of you have done, that was pretty much the point of no return for me. I understood that with Moore's law coming to a close, right, the idea that computing power has doubled every 18 months or so since its birth, that's really starting to come to a close, right? Because we can only fit so many transistors on a chip, and we're actually reaching a limit with that. So it became clear that we need something new. We need something to enable what is to be the future of AI. And that, for me, became quantum computing. And so the idea of quantum thought was born. And I started quantum thought with my co-founders based on the idea that, okay, quantum computing is really cool. But for the most part, it's locked in academia. And this is somewhat less true now than it was 3 years ago, but still to some degree very true. And in some ways for very good reason, which I'll get to. But the idea was we would create quantum thought, a venture studio. And for those of you who have never heard of a venture studio, which I had never heard of before creating one, a venture studio is something like an incubator. It is a place where you seed ideas, you come up with crazy ideas, and then you put the right people and the right resources on it and see what happens. And if something should stick, if something grows into a viable product, then you spin it out as an independent company. So it's sort of this birthplace of companies, if you will, like the nebula. And the idea behind quantum thought was, well, one, a lot of quantum is locked in academia. How do we build a bridge between academia and this demand in the enterprise for quantum computing? Very early demand, but yes, a growing demand. And two, there's a lot of really cool bets to be made in quantum computing. But since it's so early, there's it's hard to know exactly what is going to work and what isn't. And that's both what makes quantum computing exciting, but also complicated, right? So the idea was throw a bunch of ideas at the wall, see what actually sticks, right? And then ultimately let those ideas go fly on their own. So we tried a ton of things, and a lot of this process was actually me realizing I had to unlearn a lot of the hype that I had internalized around quantum computing. So some of the things that we have tried were, one, contact tracing. So using quantum computing for machine learning for contact tracing, which was really fun. We did some quantum classical hybrid clustering and got a theoretical speed up, however, not an actual speed up. One of our most advanced projects is in the quantum finance space, and that actually launched into its own company, headed by a wonderful Stanford master's student whose name is Maitre. And that was around using D-Wave to optimize bond swapping. So there's this opportunity that we saw for sort of bond arbitrage. And the idea was using annealing, we could get some kind of optimization advantage. And so that's currently in the works. We also did a lot of work around quantum chemistry, which is, in my mind, a very exciting opportunity. And the one that Richard Feynman was originally proposed quantum computing around. And that turned out to be very fun. And we did some projects. Being one of the only quantum computing shops, companies would come to us, companies in, I can't name names necessarily, but companies would come to us in the materials space or the energy space and want to work with us on pilot programs around developing new materials or what could we do in quantum. And again, these were very early applications, but very exciting results. And the thing that I found most exciting, and counter to what I initially thought coming in, was not necessarily what we could get an advantage in currently, but how much space there is in quantum to come up with new ideas. And that for me is what has kept me here. And especially around chemistry, there's, I think the standard that a lot of you probably know is variational quantum eigensolvers, which there is, even the guy who invented variational quantum eigensolvers admits that there is a lot of room to grow around that. So that all being said, the most exciting thing is how much we were able to innovate on things like that, how much we were able to come up with new ideas, which in science is extremely, extremely exciting. So let me see. I wish you could all see my slides, but
we can pause for a minute if you want to try to share.
Okay, let me see. My apologies. I'll just keep going. So the last use case, and the one that I now spend most of my time on, is in cybersecurity. And Scott Aronson has made the joke that the number one valuable use case of quantum computing is to drive up demand for quantum cybersecurity. And this points back to probably the original algorithm, Shor's, right? And what Shor's, the application, why Shor's was so exciting and terrifying, was that Shor's assures us that we can break all forms of current cybersecurity, well, most forms of cybersecurity. And that's bad, right? So a lot of the organizations that have come to us to talk to us are government, are banks, are organizations where cybersecurity is very important for obvious reasons. And so what spun out of all of these discussions was QSecure. And this is our most successful company that's spun out of Quantum Thought to date. And I now serve as Chief Product Officer there. And what we're doing is we're getting ahead of this quantum revolution. And we're building cybersecurity that lays over classical cybersecurity and protects the enterprise from these quantum hacks, because this is, I cannot overstate how devastating the idea of quantum computing breaking traditional cybersecurity is. And there's a ton of interest. This is in my mind, the first use case for quantum computing. And so what we found is that while quantum computers may be several years away, we don't actually know when they're going to come into play. And therefore, databases can be stolen now, decrypted later, what Jack Hittery calls SNDL. And QSecure is the first big company that is protecting the enterprise from that. So now kind of moving into what I think are the next 10 years in quantum, you've all seen the very exciting announcements from companies like IonQ, one of the first quantum computing companies to go public. They've developed a quantum computer with what they say is the highest quantum volume and coherent qubits. And we've heard out of Honeywell as well, all these different companies coming into the mix. And so in my world, I focus on software, and that's where I think a lot of the opportunity is, right? The opportunity to learn and develop new algorithms, but that's largely dependent on hardware. And a lot of people say that quantum computing has been hyped for a very long time. But in my experience, and what a lot of the experts I have talked to in the field are saying, is that it's a very different time right now. It's much like the last 5 years in deep learning, where you've actually seen incredible results, GPT-3, et cetera. And the difference here is that there's a ton of money going in, and it's getting real attention. While some of this is hype, yes, some of this is very, very real. And the exciting part is that companies are investing in this, and as well as private institutions. And so in my mind, the next 10 years are going to look very, very different from the last several decades. And this is the time in my mind to get in. And it's not because it's going to be an incredibly lucrative career tomorrow. It's because it's the most exciting time to be a scientist, to be an innovator, to be the Henry Ford, or to be the Steve Jobs, to be the Apple or the HP, right? And you can imagine that we're in the 1960s and 70s in quantum computing. And if you think about how the semiconductor was invented in 1961, by 1975, Bill Gates and Paul Allen had started Microsoft. Steve Jobs had revealed the first Apple computer. Oracle came around, Epsilon, SAP, et cetera. So what I would say to you is, if you're interested in quantum, don't do it right now because of the money, because there's still, it's still very much in the research phase, and we have the next 10 years to get to advantage, which I very much believe will happen in the next 10 years. But do it because you are passionate about being at the forefront, and there's so much opportunity to innovate. And as an entrepreneur, as someone who is not a PhD in quantum computing, I very much support entrepreneurship, people who are not from that academic background necessarily, as well as those who are, to get into it, to take risks. And so for me, the 3 big use cases over the next 10 years that I would bet on personally are: 1, quantum simulation and chemistry; 2, cybersecurity; and 3, AI. And when it comes to AI, this is the one I'm most excited about, but also the one where there's the biggest question mark. And so I turn it over to all of you to be the innovators, to start thinking about these problems where there's so much room and space for coming up with new ideas and being the inventors of the next wave. And with that, good luck with the hackathon. And I very much look forward to hearing about the results. And please do reach out if you ever are interested in quantum computing, if you want to talk about entrepreneurship, if you have any questions, I will send over my contact information. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. It was great to hear about your path in quantum computing and kind of where you see quantum computing moving in the future. I think kind of relating to your background and people questioning whether they have the background to enter quantum computing, a few of the questions we're getting, one was kind of about how your symbolic systems background helped you in quantum computing. And then also another question from the chat asks kind of, they say if it's possible to enter the quantum industry without a higher degree education, as a doctorate or PhD, because every job post is for high-level degrees of physicists and engineers. And there's very few entry-level jobs, even for graduate students or even internships. So maybe can you kind of had that question where you didn't, I believe you didn't ever go get a PhD. And so how do you guys grapple with that? And I think there's space for non-PhD students, obviously.
Totally. Yeah, so obviously there's a space for people like me who just have a lowly bachelor's, right? I think there's a lot to be said for, one, self-teaching. There's so many good resources out there. And while it's not as developed as maybe AI or some of the other fields, there's the MIT classes. Scott Aronson has some great notes, class notes that he's released. And it's a field where you can, to a large degree, teach yourself. Now, that being said, I don't want to make it, look like, oh, anyone can get into it. There are, for the most part, the jobs that are going to be available are to PhD researchers. And the reason for that I hinted at earlier is while there is this incredible growing demand for quantum computing, there's BCG, a large firm, estimates that by 2025 to 2030, it's going to be a $50 billion market in enterprise, right? So that's significant. It's a lot of it is still locked in research. There's still a ton of research that needs to be done to take quantum to the level it needs to be at, where we can get advantage for these companies. So, and that's in large part why their companies are looking for researchers. But if you do, there's two other paths, I would say. And I would encourage, if you are considering these two paths, again, don't get into it because you're interested in the money, because there are a lot of high paying jobs that there are a larger number of. But if you're incredibly passionate about this, I would say, no, don't kill yourself to get a PhD if that's not your thing. There are two paths. Again, one, you could take the path that I took, entrepreneurship, which is an incredibly rewarding and difficult path to take. And if you take that path, surround yourself with people smarter than you, like I have. So bring those PhDs in as advisors, or whoever else you need, and just make sure that everyone in the room is smarter than you are. And then the second path is there are actually a lot of product manager and project manager jobs at some of these well-funded quantum computing companies, Cambridge Quantum Computing, IonQ, Google, IBM, et cetera. So if you are really passionate about it, there absolutely are jobs that are not as deeply technical or as deeply academic that you can go into. But again, you will want to do exactly what you're probably doing now, doing hackathons, do these kinds of things, and learn as much as you can about quantum to prepare yourself for these jobs.
Awesome. Yeah, maybe following in on going back to Q-Secure, we have one question about like, what, like how many qubits and like what kind of computing milestones are needed before we break like classical encryption, and maybe also like for people that haven't heard about this, like how will how will quantum computers break classical encryption?
Totally. Yeah, no, it's one of the most sort of solid things that we have to work with in quantum computing right now. And so if you haven't heard of Shor's algorithm, or just to give you an overview, a lot of cryptography that we use today, or that has been standardized, is based on factorization. And until now, basically it's math that is the core of cryptography. And until quantum computers, well, with classical computers, I'll say, it's more or less impossible to, in a reasonable amount of time, break these mathematical codes. But what Peter Shor proved was that with a quantum computer, you can do it semi-trivially. And the number of qubits that we need to break, break RSA 256, I believe, is 4,096 qubits. And that could break it in a matter of minutes. And that's what a lot of our stuff is based on, right? So if you're a bank, you've got really sensitive info. If you're the government, you've got really sensitive info. You are scared at this point. Now, we are a number of years away from 4,000 qubits. And keep in mind that that is, for those of you, this is one of the demystification points about quantum computing. That's not just raw number, right? That is logical qubits. So error correction is a huge thing right now in quantum computing. The qubits that we have, so you see Google might have 50 qubits, but those are not equivalent to 50 logical qubits. Those are noisy, not super well coherent, like we can't hold on to them for a super long amount of time. So we need to get to these really good qubits, and then that is a logical qubit. And then from that logical qubit, which might in itself take 1,000 qubits to make it stable, then we can build up to those 4,000. So that being said, we are well on our way to having these really nice qubits. I'm really excited about IonQ. They use a technique that makes their qubits a little more stable. So in the next several years, we'll see really exciting things. But to wrap around to cybersecurity, the answer is that we don't know when we're going to have 4,000 qubits. We don't know if maybe other countries outside of the US are more advanced on the path than we are. And so for international cybersecurity, that's very important. But yes, essentially there need to be new standards in cybersecurity, and NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, currently has been for the last several years holding a competition to standardize the new, what they call post-quantum cryptography. And what that does is that's actually classical algorithms. So they run on classical computers, but they protect against quantum hacks. And so they're based on different math, right? And so that's what with Q-Secure we do, is we use that combined with so these new cryptographic algorithms combined with actual what they call quantum cryptography, which is in the quantum communication space. And if any of you have heard of QKD, that's a little bit of what we use, as well as quantum random number generation, which is a very real technology that is on the market today. And it's the idea that typically when classically we generate random numbers, it's programmatic. So in theory, and sometimes in practice, they're reversible, they're reverse engineerable. And so using quantum to generate genuinely random numbers, we can then seed our cryptography with these genuinely random numbers. And so I guess to bring it all to a close, the most exciting thing about Q-Secure in my mind and cybersecurity is that it's very much a now application. So with quantum, I think, there's a lot that's far off and that's exciting, but there actually is this application in cybersecurity that companies are buying now, that we are implementing now. And that's, technically with classical post-quantum algorithms and quantum communications.
Very cool. Yeah, I think there's also these RSA factoring challenges where the RSA lab, if you're able to factor these large numbers, I think it's up to 270 digits now, will give you like $100,000 if you guys want to look into that. I think kind of maybe changing gears a bit, you talked about, I think Phil 80 was the class, kind of looking at kind of this Turing test where if you can't tell the difference between an AI system and a human or a living system, then maybe we're all just kind of a computer in a sense. So one question we have is, do you think our brain works in a quantum manner?
Oh man, I am not smart enough to put forth a theory on this, but I'll tell you what I think is interesting. There are, you can kind of,
could you try again?
There's Siri's weighing in. You can kind of separate the consciousness ideas into more or less two separate camps when it comes to quantum.
As an adjective, it means forming or viewed as a unit of particle by itself.
Again, Siri.
Do you want to hear the next one?
So there's the camp of determinism, right? We are all just a kind of classical computer, logic driven. We got a lot of variables we're working with, but ultimately, like, everything arises because something happened before that and put us into a certain state. And I find that one obviously compelling because we don't have any proof that consciousness is something more than that. But there's also kind of there's another exciting camp that is more controversial, but it's, if you've heard of Roger Penrose, it's this idea that our brains are, sort of like, if you think of it in a sort of metaphysical way, inspiration comes from quantum entanglement, and maybe the many worlds hypothesis is true, and we're getting, there's some quantum element to consciousness. So there's these two camps. I like to think that with quantum, there's a lot that is exciting and feels very magical, even though it's very scientific. So it opens up a lot of doors, and we just don't know is the answer. I think we can only really understand humans and our own logic from a behavioral standpoint, but I think there's a lot to find out, and I am actually excited about quantum for potentially helping us understand more about these big questions of what is a thinking thing.
Wow, really interesting. We've had a few questions on this, and I wanted to bring this up, but a question often posed to the Stanford Women CS organization is, as a woman, how have you navigated this field, and what advice and key tips would you have for fellow women interested in the field?
Totally. Yeah, no, it's a challenge. I really do hope that there are a lot of women out there and people from diverse backgrounds in the audience today. When I set out with Quantum Thought, one of my goals was to make the company at least half women or non-binary, and I'm still working on that. But it's again one of the reasons I got into quantum that I didn't totally touch on when I was talking, but a large part of why I got into AI was jumping off of these big questions. What are the ethics around developing futuristic technology, especially technology that makes its own decisions, right? So in my mind, in a way, quantum computing is not necessarily separate from previous technologies from AI. It's in a lot of ways the evolution. And as we know, quantum computers are not a better light bulb it's, it's just like a microwave is not a better campfire, right? It's just something completely different, and it has different use cases. And so it's really not gonna, I do want to be very careful to make sure to be clear that quantum computing is not just, going to revolutionize everything. And I think that's what a lot of the media says. It's going to be in very specific use cases. But yes, it's going to help us evolve and advance technology significantly. And to be able to be at the forefront of that, where it's really beginning, where a few years ago there were only 800 people in it, is exciting, not just from the ability to innovate, not just that it's this wild west open for research questions and problems and discoveries. It's also that we have this opportunity to shape the ecosystem from the ground up, right? And so bringing it back to women, I think one of the ways in which we can ensure, or we can push to ensure ethical development of technology is bringing more diversity into the workforce. We see a lot of this stuff in AI happening, a lot of the kind of racist or prejudice issues we see with AI. Some of that does come from the homogeneity of the groups that are developing AI. So, definitely unintentionally, right? But if a certain group is overrepresented in building these technologies, then it's probably gonna happen that that group's experience is overrepresented in the ultimate technology. So quantum, we have this opportunity to bring in more diversity at the very beginning. And I definitely think women, get out there, show them that we can do it. I would love to see this be one of the first STEM fields where there's more women going into PhDs, there's more women in the field than men, women non-binary, more diversity. And I don't want to make it just a women and men problem. But yes, as far as my own personal, I'll get off my soapbox. But as far as my own personal experience, it's, I often am the only woman in the room. And it can be tough. And I think entrepreneurship has really, it's given me a tougher outer shell. I think when I first came in, I assumed that most people in the room knew more than me, or that their level of experience or expertise was directly correlated with their level of confidence with which they spoke about it, which I found actually to be totally untrue. A lot of people speak with a lot of confidence, but that doesn't always match what they know. And as a woman, I found that I and a lot of the other women, strong, powerful women I know, tend to undersell rather than oversell our own knowledge. So some of the things that I've learned over the last several years in entrepreneurship is that sometimes I just need to be louder, step up, and sometimes I'm going to be wrong. And, not just as a woman, but as a perfectionist, that's a hard one, right? Imposter syndrome, etc. But yeah, just kind of voice opinions, because that's what a lot of other people are doing. And I think men are better at this than women. And, and I also want to kind of affirm that, yes, it is hard to be the only woman in the room at sometimes. And so forming groups of support, if you are a woman in quantum computing or CS, feel free to reach out to me for mentorship. I would definitely like to see more women, but it's, and I think it's growing. I see a lot of very strong women represented. But I also don't want to play down that it's, that it is an extra challenge, but with that, it is an opportunity. And so I very much encourage women to push ahead and kind of fight, whatever institutional blockers there are to be well represented here.
Yeah, and maybe a follow-up to that. I'm curious if you have any thoughts as to like where you could see potential like biases coming in from like a homogeneity in quantum computing.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been really fortunate to be able to start working with the World Economic Forum to put in place a code of ethics around quantum computing. And a lot of the groundwork has been from the ethical codes that have come out of AI. I think So one of the examples in AI that I point to often is there's a piece of software that got attention. It helps judges make decisions on whether or not to grant parole, and it looks at a criminal profile and basically tells the judge whether or not they're likely to commit another crime should they be granted parole. And what was found about this piece of technology, this software, was that it was just straight up racist, racist and classist. And it's not necessarily because the people that were programming it were that, but AI is only as good as the data that we feed it. And a lot of the data was, historical data, and the court systems have not always been as woke as they are hopefully growing to be. So, the data that we feed these things is very important, and that data is generated by human bias, right? A lot of the time. And so when it comes to quantum, it's a lot of the same problems actually. And when we start to move forward in quantum AI, which is still to some degree a big question mark, we're going to see even more black boxy algorithms, models, and it's going to be even more necessary to be deliberate about the data that we feed into these things. So in my mind, it's not just the people and their biases building it, but people being aware and coming from different backgrounds, different experiences, having faced different things, different perspectives, to be able to look at this data and say, I don't know about this, or here's what we can control for, or to bring their own unique perspective to this when we're building these things. And hopefully, if quantum computing does enable the next generation of AI, that we train into it are the better angels of our nature, right? Instead of our historic prejudices. So bringing more diversity into the workforce is, I think, one of the best ways that we can start to do that.
Oh yeah, and with regards to bringing more diversity into the workforce, and how would you create a welcoming environment that helps encourage people from more diverse backgrounds to come in, and how have you tried to cut through bias and things like that in the workforce?
Yeah, totally. A lot of people turn to the idea that there's a quote unquote pipeline problem when they're hiring to get around hiring a diverse workforce. Pipeline problem being the idea that there's just not enough representation in the pool of applicants, that if I want to choose the best applicant, it's not there. And I think that's a bit of a fallacy. So what I've done in the past with Quantum Thought and Q-Secure is go out to the source. So I've been to career fairs at Stanford and recruited people. And my first right-hand person was Maitreyi Gopalakrishnan. She was a woman. She was born in India, and she was the best person for the job, but also brought her unique perspective to it. What else? I think you have to be really active. I actually respond to Reddit posts sometimes. So people on the quantum computing community on Reddit, I'll talk to them. I get a lot of applications, and I'm happy to see that a lot of them are international from other places. But I think one of the main things that I like to do to ensure that I'm being active in building up that diverse team is actually going to different places where people might not be People might not be submitting applications, but I find them. So I have noticed too that a lot of the sources that I get cold applications from are men, and I don't know if that's just kind of like it's more they're more predisposed to send those cold applications. But women, I would encourage you, if you don't know that this is a thing, just like reach out cold. I used to do this in college actually, and I got to meet a lot of really cool people like Marissa Meyer and some other crazy, Reid Hoffman. Just guess people's email. So especially if they're at a small company, it's probably their first name at whatever their URL is. And I literally met a ton of people that way. And you'll be surprised as a student how many people are willing to write back to you, because you're not really soliciting anything from them. You're not trying to sell them anything. You're a student. People really want to help. So that's one kind of life hack from the other side. And so yeah, women, please, do that. Reach out to people that you think are cool. Find mentors. But yeah, I try to be active. And then once on the team for each of my projects at Quantum Thought, I had a project manager, but I also had an ethics manager. And so we have templates, right, that are, are you checking these boxes? Are you looking at the data for bias? Are you looking at, So someone who's actually overseeing the data and the build of this thing to ensure that it goes in an ethical direction.
Great. That's really interesting to hear about. Yeah, I guess we have a few questions in the chat, kind of more on what you see quantum computing becoming, I guess. So one question is, what is the most exciting current project in quantum AI? And they cite, I guess, quantum TensorFlow. And then another question is asking about what near-term quantum computing applications you see with NISQ systems. So I think that's referring back to these noisy intermediate scale quantum systems that I think Preskel alludes to, and I think it's like 40 years ago now, or 50 years ago now. But yeah, what do you see in the near future?
That's a great question. I think the easy answer for me is the right now application is cybersecurity. And that's a little bit of a cheat, right? Because it's not technically quantum computing, it's the prevention against quantum computing hacks. I think the one that I'm most excited about is AI, but I think probably and again, I have my slides up and I have exactly this kind of diagram of what the use cases are. And I can, how about I send these out after the talk? So if you're interested, you can look at them. But I think chemistry, honestly, is for me what's going to pop first. And there's a lot of exciting stuff that we can do in chemistry, not just like imagine. So I was on a panel at the beginning of the pandemic about quantum computing and the coronavirus, which was obviously very, forward looking, but, imagine having a universal fault tolerant quantum computer at the beginning of the pandemic to be able to simulate different chemical compositions, vaccines, et cetera. We might be in a very different place than we are right now. So I think, the thing that may end up changing the world the most is our ability to simulate these quantum mechanical systems and come up with new ways to develop materials, develop drugs, et cetera. So just to kind of frame it, there's the molecule penicillin, I think, has basically, if you wanted to simulate the, I believe, ground state energy of the molecule penicillin, which is not an especially complex molecule, but if you want to do that on a classical computer, it would take more transistors, so more bits than atoms in the entire known universe, right? So impossible. But if you wanted to do it on a quantum computer, you would need only 286 qubits. So the idea that we can simulate these energy states of these molecules and understand how they behave and how to get certain properties out of them, that's, I think, over the next 10 years, what we're going to see be the most exciting exciting part of this quantum journey. What was the other part of the question? Quantum AI, what are some of the most exciting use cases?
Yeah, quantum AI are these NISQ. I think Preskel basically introduced these noisy intermediate quantum devices, which are like smaller. So like with 50 qubits, 100 qubits, and they're quite noisy. Kind of what can you do with them? And yeah, what do you see in the near term with these devices?
Yeah, again, great question. I think that's the question that's on everybody's mind, right? And there's a lot of, you know, no pun intended, noise around that answer. Side note, if you are new to quantum and you haven't checked out John Preskel or Scott Aronson, those are two very bright thought leaders in the quantum space that I'd read some of their blogs. So AI, a lot of people kind of refuse to talk about AI right now in the quantum space because it is a little elusive. So for example, when I jumped into quantum and we started working, we had a project around medical imaging using quantum computing. And I think at some point we realized we would need one logical qubit for every pixel that we were analyzing. So that kind of brought us to a halt at that point. And I think that's what we face with a lot of the AI applications is we need more better qubits. And another thing is that a lot of these algorithms that we've come up with. So if you are interested in AI, look at Grovers. There's a lot of cool potential things we can do with Grovers. But a lot of these algorithms need you to look at large amounts of classical data. And so we run into this thing where we need to go back and forth in a hybrid style between classical and quantum. And that at this point eliminates a lot of the potential advantage we can get. So, and I'm sorry to answer the question with kind of a downer answer, but the silver lining of this is that there's no doubt in my mind that there are real cool applications in quantum AI that are also coming over the next 10 years. And there have been a lot of papers that have proved theoretical quantum speed up with things like GANs. And there's also a lot of work in quantum inspired algorithms as well. So those are classical algorithms that are inspired by quantum computing logic. So for example, there is this brilliant 18-year-old who published a paper on a quantum inspired recommender system that got some kind of speed up over classical. So there's that. There's a lot of innovation to be had in the quantum AI space. And I think a lot of that will come when we start getting more and more advanced computers. But I'll kind of leave it up to you guys to make some of those discoveries.
Thank you. And we've gone 10 minutes over our previously allocated question time. Yeah, I was just kind of curious. We've talked a bit about this, but like the AI, the difference between like the long term and like the short term applications of AI. Do you have any thoughts towards like the long term impact of AI? Just venturing out here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, there's a lot of bottlenecks and a lot of people do come into quantum computing via AI, or those in quantum computing have some AI background. And so a lot of people are familiar with some of the bottlenecks that do exist in AI. And a lot of that has to do with optimizing, and we just don't have the computational capacity to optimize for certain things. I joked that when I was doing freelancing, I was doing a project for a company that had software for, basically I was supposed to write a program that predicted the price of wholesale produce tomorrow and also 5 days from now. And this is the one that I was joking about like being the stock market problem. So I was like, oh yeah, I can do that, no problem. And then I realized, no, it's actually really hard to predict how those things go. And one of the reasons is that when I started out with that, I was like, oh, I'm going to take in all sorts of variables. This is one of my early projects. Yeah, I'm going to take in all sorts of variables. I'm going to take in weather reports in natural language, and I'm going to take in stock prices for XYZ, and I'm going to take in whether the farmer had a stomach ache 3 days ago, and all these different things that we as humans might be able to look at and say, draw some conclusions from. And what I realized was, it's not really feasible, or at the very least easy, with today's tools. And so I think, with quantum, I'll get a bit of a slap on the wrist from like real quantum scientists for describing it this way, but the way that I like to think about it and talk about it when I talk with business executives or people not super familiar with quantum is, if you imagine a quantum computer, or so imagine a maze, right? And you as a human are trying to solve that maze. So you enter into the maze and you hit your first T, and you can go right or left. So you as a human, you gotta choose left, right? You hit another T, you choose another path. So that's the way that we work in the classical world. That's the way that classical computers work, generally speaking. We can send out little parallel bots to try to find the best path through the maze, but it's really iterative. But quantum computer, right? And this is when I try to think about the power of quantum computing. This is what I think of. The quantum computer enters a maze, hits its first T. It doesn't have to choose, right? It can go right and left at the same time. And so if you cleverly program your quantum computer, you can take all paths through that maze simultaneously. And again, if you're clever, you can figure out how to cancel out all the wrong answers and prune those off, and what you're left with is the most optimal path. And so, intuitively, if we think about that as relates to AI, there's going to be a lot of doors that this opens up. But we also need a lot of clever people to find the algorithms to figure out how to cleverly prune off those wrong answers, right? So intuitively, yes, quantum computing, once we have a 100 logical qubit quantum computer, I think we're going to start seeing some really fun stuff in all spaces. But I think that's where we can start playing around really with AI. PsiQuantum has said somewhat privately that they're going to have a quantum computer of that size in the next several years. So I think they've said they'll have 1 million physical qubits and some handful of logical qubits. IonQ has made promises, Honeywell, IBM, Google. So, we need to leverage what we intuitively know to have potential to come up with these clever algorithms like Shor's, like Grover's, to, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, whenever it is, really take us to the next step in taking in many variables, making better sense of data faster. And that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the future is really bright. A quick wrap up question for like a message to our hackers on the day before the hackathon starts. Some of our challenges are less technical and are more like proposal based. Do you have any last minute advice for writing good proposals and like showcasing like the ability of quantum algorithms?
Oh man, that's a great question. Let's see. So there's a lot of cool stuff that has been done out there. I would start by looking at some of the companies that have come out of CDL, Creative Destruction Lab, out of Canada. They have a specifically quantum incubator. And if you look at some of the companies that have come out of there, they got really creative solutions for things. So you can start to see what some people have played around with. There's a website called Quantum Algorithm Zoo, which lists all of the quantum algorithms and what kind of speed ups you get, and to some degree what use cases they have. So if you're looking for like what theoretical things you can do, that's a good place to start to see what we have to work with. Let's see. Have fun with it. I think learn from what I think. Be grounded in reality. So I know this from experience coming into quantum. There's a lot that we want to be able to do, and then there's the reality of what we can do now versus in the future. So take these use cases that have been successful to date and build on them. That's what I would do. Otherwise, have fun with it. Feel free to reach out and ping me on Discord. I can throw some ideas your way, some things that we decided not to work on with quantum thought, or that we tried that didn't work out then, but might work out now, who knows? So yeah, have fun with it.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for your time out of your busy schedule. And this was like a really amazing talk. So
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew, for the opportunity.
All right, and I'll end the live stream on that high note.